Welcome to the Week Ahead, a podcast by SBM Intelligence. I'm your host, Veronica Pana Igube. Every Friday, we explore stories that are shaping our continent. Deadly protests happened in Kenya and Togo. In Kenya, 16 people were killed, mostly by police, during demonstration against the government, marking 1 year since similar protests where over 60 died. In Togo, 7 people died during the protests over economic problems. What can African governments do to keep peace during protests without using deadly force? President Bola Tinubu has signed 4 new tax laws to help grow Nigeria's economy and attract global investment. One major change is that only the Nigerian Revenue Service will collect federal taxes, taking this role away from agencies like customs. How will this centralized taxing collection under the NRS impact efficiency and transparency in Nigeria's tax system? Finally, River State leaders have ended their political fight after President Tinubu stepped in. Governor Fubara and Minister Wike agreed to work together for the state's progress. How does this deal affect democracy and party politics in River State? Joining us today for further insights is Ayotunde Abiodun, a policy analyst at SBM. Welcome, Ayo, to the podcast.
Thank you, Veronica. Always a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Let's start with our first story with the deadly protest in Kenya and Togo. Before we start, we want to send our prayers to those to the people of Kenya and Togo as well, for those who are fighting for justice and protesting peacefully on the streets, who have lost their lives. We send our condolences to their family. But it's a sad experience when we see that citizens come out, to protest, to register their dissent with the government, and they are faced with brutal force. I know this keeps happening, and we've seen like a reoccurrence in different African countries, and now we're experiencing it with Kenya and Togo. How do you think our African government can ensure that people protest peacefully as well without the use of force, deadly force on the citizens who are just protesting?
All right, brilliant question. But I think it's important to establish that majority of the protests we see play out across Africa are always triggered by the poor economic conditions. So particularly in Togo, we saw that the protests were rooted in inflation and joblessness. And what it just means is that addressing these systemic issues is the way for African government to avoid this unrest. Also in Kenya, we saw massive protests last year, and the protest this year was just an anniversary of that of last year. So one key lesson for African government is for them to avoid this face-off with their citizens in the context of protest. They need to improve the economic conditions. That being said, I think it's also important to point out that African government tend to treat protests as security threats rather than see them as democratic expressions, which is what they really are. So the whole idea is that if the citizens are not happy about development in their country, they can go on the street and protest against the government of the day for them to sit up and act right. But what we see is that whenever protests play out, the African governments see them as threats to security. And this flows from that understanding that a lot of African countries are wired in a way of regime security and not really the security of lives and property of the people. So I think those fundamentals needs to be stated. And I think a big aspect of this whole conversation has to be with the fact that there's been lack of police accountability, because you cannot tell me that if there are consequences for police actors who would misbehave during protests, over years we're meant to see a decline in confrontations or the use of lethal weapons against civilians. So the fact that we've not really seen police accountability, which is either non-existent or is not transparent enough. This has made police forces to continue to operate with impunity. And until we start seeing a trend whereby civilian death must lead to consequences, I think we're not going to see a change. That being said, more importantly, for countries like Kenya and Togo, reforms need to happen. So in terms of like police reform, so this government must invest in their police, basically train these police forces on how to use non-lethal um, weapons. So basically how to control the crowd, and there must be more transparency in terms of how bad actors are being subjected to the laws, and basically the whole process of how bad police actors are being um, reformed, basically. So um, all of this is really important. We need reforms to take place. Basically, we need to see more oversight, independent oversight, and also have like open formal protest channels. One thing remains clear: the right to protest is a fundamental right of citizens anywhere in the world. So, the African government can recognize that they cannot trump on that right. All they need to do is to, rather than perceive the right to protest as security threats, it is a democratic expression, and they need to allow those expressions continue. What African government should really do is to look at the underlying triggers of these protests and then solve those problems. So I think that would be my take on this particular story.
I mean, I do agree with you. I mean, you mentioned several points that that are really salient by saying, you know what, they have to be held accountable. Because if time and time and again we experience police brutality and nothing is done, then, and they are not held accountable as well, then we see that the police will continue to do and use violence against citizens even in time. And then you mentioned something also that is really, really good, was where you talked about the government seeing protests as a security threat. But the government needs to understand that, every government should be able to take some level of criticism from the people. Because it's that way you're able to see things that are working and things that are not working as well. And you mentioned institutional reforms, ensuring accountability, and also addressing the underlying causes. Because we've seen like it's mostly when it comes to poverty, human rights violations, economic challenges that we see people come to the streets to protest. Thank you very much for that. Let's move over
Also,
to yeah. Okay. I thought you wanted to say something.
no, 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 this,
Okay, let's move over to our second story. So we saw a kind of a reform. For a while we've been hearing about, the tax reforms coming, but this week we saw the president sign into law 4 tax bills in Nigeria that have changed entirely our tax collection system. It has brought in the Nigerian Revenue Service, So, it's interesting to see how our tax regime in Nigeria is being changed, reformed. What do you think? Tell us some of the highlights of this reform. What do you think this implication will be for Nigeria for having like a centralized federal tax collection? And do you think that this reform will also curb corruption and, all the leakages that we have in our tax regime? Or does it have this risk of creating a new monopoly with limited accountability?
all right. Thank you so much for your question. So first, I will say credit has to go to the Bola Tinubu administration for being able to get these tax reforms out. So if you understand our history as a country, you know that taxes are really political in nature, and the fact that he has been able to get all stakeholders on board on this should be complemented. Having said that, some highlight of the tax reforms Basically, he's harmonizing on our tax laws into one codified document and then trying to do away with multiple taxations at the various levels of government, state, federal, and local. So the whole idea is to improve the ease of doing business in Nigeria, because over the years, multiple taxation has been one thing that either multinationals or local companies would tell you had made them pack up. So again, it's a very key highlight that we're trying to harmonize and then simplify the tax process with the end goal of making businesses very easy to run and then keying to this administration's um, $1 trillion economic value, basically. But having said that, in the context of our conversation today, the conversation really about the establishment of the Nigeria Revenue Service as the sole federal tax collector. So basically, this is a change from the current status quo where we have, outside of the FRS, we also have some agencies like customs. You have the oil regulator, the upstream oil regulator, agencies like that, also the port authority. These agencies to also collect taxes in a way, and what that basically led to a situation whereby agencies like customs, agencies like the Nigerian Port Authority were more focused on tax collection. Basically, they were more focused on revenue generation than actual service delivery. But you also factor in the importance of those kind of agencies in the economy. Ideally, customs should be concerned with facilitating trade, international trade, in terms of import and export. But over the years, we saw that their focus shifted to generating revenue, and it got to a point whereby we will see the legislative houses setting targets for how much they should generate in a year. And so, I mean, that was just a ridiculous practice, because when you prioritize revenue generation over service delivery, it just means that you're going to allow anything goes just to meet that particular threshold. And that was not good enough for the economy in the whole. But so I think it's a good thing that we're having a sole federal tax collector. So when we be in mind what happens in a place like the UK, where they also have a sole tax collector. But I think the fundamental issue is trust. So if you understand that Nigerians have been paying taxes over the years, and we've not had transparency and accountability in terms of how taxes are being deployed. So with all the taxes being generated in the country, we still see trends of we going to massively borrow. So all of these are problems that, regardless of what this whole tax reform offer, if we cannot close that trust deficit that currently exists, I don't think we would really get the benefit of this consolidated revenue collection agency. So at the core of it is that we need to solve that trust deficit and then be more transparent in how much taxes are generated, how much goes to and what project. So that's really what will get Nigerians to buy this whole system. And there's also a tendency that we see pushbacks from the agencies that will be taking off the role of tax collection, because for a long time they relied on that revenue source. So there might be pushback from them, sort of, but I don't expect that pushback to really take any effect, because already this whole system is to kick off in January 2026. So there's a lot to that effect. But again, the most fundamental discussing point in this conversation is the trust. As much as we are now consolidating the tax revenue agency, is there going to be trust in how taxes generated are utilized for public good? That is the main question to be asked.
I mean, true, that's the main question to ask because, when people pay their taxes, I mean, they want to see like their taxes are being used like right. And not like, I mean, because when people can't even see like the effects of paying taxes, so they are not seeing the good roads, the electricity, and other social amenities that they're supposed to enjoy from the benefits of paying their taxes. When citizens are not able to see that, like you said, it breaks the trust system, and people don't want to pay their taxes because they don't see the benefit of those taxes. But hopefully, this new service, would take that turnaround in building trust, like you mentioned. And it has a lot of time to do that. So there's like a 6 month where it can, I think that they can take on the steps of, capacity building, raising a lot of awareness for people to be, and just kind of changing the mentality of Nigerians to imbibe into the system of paying taxes as well. And also building that transparency and that openness for people to be able to see how their taxes will be used. Thank you very much for that. Let's move on to our final story. Also, something that we saw this week in Nigeria is the Rivers State leaders have ended, their political fight. We saw President Tinubu intervene and step in to resolve the rift between Governor Fubara and Minister Wike. Um, so there has been like an agreement, basically. Um, I mean, one of the agreements is that Governor Fubara would not run in 2027. I mean, we've heard the stories. It's good that we have seen that there's a resolution. I mean, what are your thoughts on the agreement? Do you think it's fair, you know, to Governor Fubara to say, you know what, don't run the next time? Does that impede his right to run for office as a Nigerian? How do you think the Rivers State people would take it as well? And what do you think for the process that is, I mean, we have an administrator presently in Rivers State. So do we see a turnaround where there's a reinstatement of Fubara as governor and taking away that administrator? Just what are your thoughts generally on this resolution?
All right, thank you so much for your question. So I'll say this, as someone with a legal background, I'm not comfortable with what has played out in Rivers State. So I first of the opinion that if you peruse the entire provisions of our constitution, there's no constitutional provision that granted Tinubu to have suspended a validly elected governor in the first place, no matter how you want to interpret those provisions. Yes, he can declare a state of emergency in the state, but that does not translate to being a basis for him to suspend a validly elected governor. So having said that, so I don't, again, I'm not fine with the arrangement of saying Tinubu had um, brokered a truce between the warring factions, and now Fubara is to come back to office. I'm of the opinion that this should have been challenged in court. We needed to see, I think we need to see a Supreme Court verdict on what Tinubu did, if that suspension was valid, considering the provisions of our constitution to that effect. So what I think is thinking about it from like an economic standpoint, and this might serve as um, a news that eases tension because I'm sure the economic um, trend in Rivers State basically took a pause since the suspension because it basically overrode a lot of uncertainty because people were not so sure about how the various stakeholders were going to react. One would have expected to see more violence in the state, but thankfully that had not played out. So with this now, um, on the economic front, things might get a bit better. Investment that naturally were paused in that state can now be reactivated, basically. And if you consider how important Rivers is to Nigeria as a country, considering how oil rich the country is, yeah. But politically, I do not think it is fair. Um, basically the agreement that Fubara have to ditch his second term ambition just to be able to come back to office. I'm not fine with that arrangement, but it's not my call to make. I basically see this as uh, I don't know, man. I think the judiciary has just like failed to basically come to play in this instance. I think this sort of development in Rivers State should have gotten utmost judicial intervention and attention. We should have gotten a ruling. I don't think the whole 6 month thing, I think it's almost the suspension should have been on for about 2, 3 months now. Not so sure on the timeline, but it shouldn't have lead that on, in my opinion. We should have gotten like judicial verdict as to whether or not the president's action was valid or not. But having said that, at the personal level, I think Fuba did not come to play ball. I think he could have been stubborn enough to really challenge the president's action. But again, it just shows you how politicians in this side of the world are not so bent on. They're not really people oriented. It's more like personal interest. Because I expect a governor who really wants to work for his people to have utilized the court to get his mandate back and not cower and go and negotiate at Aso Rock and then now get this sort of deal. So again, it just shows the nature of politics we play in this part of the world. It's really just basically personal interest. And it's just sad when you have a political elite who are just looking out for themselves. Because I expect that if you are really people oriented, you will not accept this sort of deal because it should be an honor of a lifetime to serve your people for 2 terms. But again, what's done is done. But I think overall, we should see governance come back to play in terms of what it should actually be in Rivers State. Um, Again, looking forward towards 2027, I think we what has played out in Rivers State. I think in terms of relevance, I think Wike doesn't hold that relevance any longer because it seems like Fuba has now become a pawn for Tinubu since Tinubu is able to cover him away from running for a second term and seeing as if he has gotten that representation from football for not running for second time, it basically makes the president be in control of Rivers State going into 2027 election. That is, he can control the outcome there, especially with the resources at his control as incumbent. This basically shows that Wike's value to him is diminishing. So um, I think overall the president is the one who got the best of deals in this whole development. But for if we narrow this conversation back to the people of River State, I think it's a sad development for them. I still think, and I expect that this development should be contested in court, and we should get a judicial verdict so that we can at least get a precedent as to not allowing the president to be able to do this sort of thing again in any other states. But on on a localized level, I think it's good because I'm sure governors will not have been as the way it should with the sole administrator in the state. Um, it's not like when you have a validly elected governor calling the shot in the state. So on a localized level, I think governors should be back in swing, and then this can trigger more economic development for the people. So I think I'll just keep my thoughts as that.
Thank you, Ayo, for your thoughts. I know that there are quite a number of cases in court, and hopefully we get like a decision, as you earlier stated, that will prevent this incident from happening again. Thank you very much, Ayo, for joining us today. And to all our listeners, this podcast is by SBM Intelligence. You can access our podcast by searching for SBM Intelligence anywhere you find podcasts. For deeper insights into our work, visit our website at sbmintel.com. Remember to connect with us on all our social media platforms. You can find us on X, Facebook, Blue Sky, LinkedIn at SBM Intelligence. That's all for today. Thank you for listening.